Our first speaker is Dan Weiner, and he is Deputy Director of the Brennan Center's Election Reform Program. This program covers money in politics, election security, government ethics, and other democracy and rule of law issues. Dan is a frequent media commentator and provides advice and assistance to lawmakers at all levels of government. Following Dan will be Professor Edward Foley. Professor Foley holds the Ebersol Chair in Constitutional Law at Ohio State University, where he also directs the election law program. Professor Foley is a contributing opinion columnist for the Washington Post, a frequent media commentator, and served in 2020 as an election law analyst for NBC. His most recent book, published in 2020, is Presidential Elections and Majority Rule. So welcome, Dan and Ned. And Dan, I'm turning the program over to you, and I'll return for the Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure to be here. This is an incredibly important topic and obviously one that's been in the news. So I thought that what we would do is just take a couple minutes to talk a little bit about the bill, the For the People Act, and what's in it. And then what I'd like to use my time to do is to just walk through a couple of the kind of pressing questions that you might have in your mind right now as we look at how this bill is progressing through Congress. So the For the People Act is really historic legislation. It is intended to tackle many of the most pressing challenges faced by our democracy right now. And that includes, obviously, the right to vote and protecting the right to vote. We are seeing an unprecedented effort to roll back voting rights across the country right now. Well over a dozen states, almost 24, have passed restrictive laws, including some very restrictive laws that would seriously curtail voting rights, and really, in some ways, one of the worst sort of efforts to roll back voting rights we've seen in more than a decade. And obviously, to the point things have gotten sufficiently polarized around that all the Democrats in the Texas legislature, most of them literally fled the state to hold off this law. So we've got a real fight brewing in the states. We are standing on the cusp of another cycle of congressional redistricting that's likely to be characterized by extreme gerrymandering, particularly in the states in the Southeast, which are becoming more diverse and more closely politically divided, where kind of entrenched majorities seem determined to try to use their power to draw congressional maps to stem changing political facts on the ground. And then, of course, we have a campaign finance system that is to some extent a little bit out of control. The 2020 election was by far the most expensive in our history. In the decade plus since Citizens United, the proportion of money coming from the very wealthiest donors has increased exponentially relative to small donors. And we obviously, see that as driving, in many respects, a lot of the cynicism and a lot of the sort of disenchantment with our political system. And that has given rise, among other things, to kind of burgeoning extremism on both sides of the political spectrum. So our democracy faces a number of challenges, and that's, of course, not even beginning with the kind of unprecedented, series of events that we saw in the aftermath of the 2020 election, and the threat, to essentially try to overturn the result. The For the People Act meets these challenges, and it does so with a number of different provisions. So, the first third or so of the act is devoted to protecting voting rights, and it really does incorporate, what we at the Brennan Center see as kind of the best practices nationwide. 2 weeks of early voting, no excuse vote by mail, finally modernizing voter registration in this country. The United States is one of the last advanced democracies that still employs a kind of ramshackle system where you have to register to vote. Sometimes you can't even do it online and then show up to vote. And we've seen that really does disenfranchise many people, particularly many people of color and younger voters. And then the bill also would ban partisan gerrymandering and would specify neutral criteria under which district lines should be drawn, not including partisanship, but including protection for communities of color and sort of other communities of interest, so that you actually draw districts that represent the political interests of the American people instead of for partisan advantage. And then the bill also contains some pretty major and long overdue campaign finance reforms, a system of small donor public financing to try to give people a path to run for office without depending uniquely on major donors, to major disclosure rules, and an overhaul of our troubled agents regulator, the Federal Election Commission. So these are, we can talk more about specifics later on, but those are just sort of the highlights. What I want to kind of end by doing is just, thinking about a couple things that are most pressing in people's minds. Now, one of them, I'm sure many of you are thinking right now is, of course, well, isn't it, can it actually pass, right? What is going to happen with this bill? And I imagine we'll be talking more about that. But the thing that I want to emphasize right now, first of all, is that the bill is very much alive. It is the subject of, I think, very intense negotiations right now in Congress. I think that there is a misperception that, the procedural vote that the Senate took, earlier in June was kind of a one and done situation. That is not the case. So the bill very much is alive. And I think when you actually look closely at the public statements for the key deciders here, you can see that while they'll say things like, we need to be careful about eliminating the filibuster, we'll have chaos, there's a lot of nuance there. So right now, I would predict that the next 2 to 4 weeks are going to be critical for seeing whether this is going to get across the finish line. But I do think that there is a conventional wisdom that's set in, which is that it's sort of hopeless. And I just don't think that's true. I think this is very much a live debate happening in Washington right now, and one that everyone should be paying attention to. And then the other thing I think is that, the bill was introduced 2 years ago, and it was reintroduced again in this Congress. And obviously a lot's changed. We had a crisis in the aftermath of the 2020 election. I do believe, and I'm sure Professor Foley will speak some to this and to some of these concerns, but I do believe this bill directly addresses not only these sort of long-standing challenges that we've had around the right to vote, around money in politics, but also some of the more pressing concerns that arose in the aftermath of 2020. And I believe probably, there will be a process where it might even be amended to do more of that, if news reports are to be believed. So I do think it very much is still the bill for the moment. And I think that the key deciders understand how urgent this is. And now really is kind of crunch time for this bill. And so, we're on the cusp of fairly major changes, but, things are still very much remain to be seen. And so I'm looking forward to this discussion. I'm looking forward to talking, about what we need to do to fix our democracy, and also, how folks, if you want federal legislation to pass, what you can do yourselves, I think, to make that more of a reality. I think at that point, I'll hand it back, Ned, if you'd like to say your thoughts.
Sure. No, I think that's a good point to segue. Because I think, as Dan said, the bill was initially written before the January 6th insurrection in the previous Congress. And I do think the question is, what do we need now? What does Congress need to adopt now in this very fraught moment where our democracy really is in peril? And what concerns me about the For the People Act, first of all, it's huge. It's over 800 pages long. It has a lot in it. And I think its size makes it easy to oppose, because if you oppose something in it, you might, block it. And so you can have a coalition of defeat, unfortunately. my own take on what we need as a democracy, and this is a nonpartisan perspective, is we need two healthy parties that believe in competition and believe in playing fairly by an agreed upon set of rules. And what is perilous at the moment, quite frankly, is the Republican Party is in danger of not even accepting the basics of electoral competition. And you can't just have one political party willing to believe in democracy, because a healthy democracy has to have a competitive system. There's going to be reasonable disagreements in society about all sorts of public policy issues, from environmental protection to tax policy to healthcare policy. And so a democracy is healthy only if the competitors are willing to play the game and play the game fairly. There are Republicans, unfortunately it's the minority of the party at the moment, who are standing up for fair play and electoral integrity. Folks like Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, I think everybody knows the list. The existential imperative to democracy is to protect that portion of that party from which is on life support, as it were. And that means that electoral reform in improving and fixing the party has to be a bipartisan objective. And unfortunately, the For the People Act, the way it was initially written and the way it has progressed, up until the point in which Senator Manchin has tried to come up with a compromise, was not that approach. It was not an attempt to reach across the aisle to the Liz Cheneys and the Mitt Romneys of the world and say, what do we agree upon and how can we rebuild democracy together? I mean, we may have a bit of differences about how we do vote by mail or how we do voter ID or how we do early voting, but we all believe in democracy, so let's do this together. Instead, the For the People Act was written as a Democratic Party bill to try to get what the Democratic Party want, and it's a tell that every single Republican in Congress, including Liz Cheney, Mitt Romney, and Lisa Murkowski, and those four, all completely unanimously oppose it. So what the Democrats have done, unfortunately, since January 6th, is done their best effort to unite the two components of the Republican Party, the pro-democracy component and the anti-democracy component, and they put Josh Hawley and Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney and Jim Jordan all on the same page on this issue. And I think that was a tactical mistake. I think it was also a strategic mistake in terms of figuring out how to have a democracy going into 2022 and 2024, and time is of the essence on this. So what I think what should have happened and what should happen is to figure out, how, can you get something that qualifies as bipartisan? Given the filibuster rule, you would need 10 Republican senators, which would be a challenge, not necessarily impossible if you take components of the bill and take all 800 pages and carve it into sections. There might be pieces of it that could get 60 votes, but that's not been tested. Instead, it's been an effort to ram the entire thing through one way or the other. And so far that's going to fail, and I think that is going to fail, and democracy will suffer as a consequence. Also, the clock is really ticking on this, and different issues have different timetables. Before I get to that important point, let me just say one thing about, again, the Democratic Party is entitled to its own view of policy preferences. And I have no objection to Democrats, meaning, large D, capital D Democrats, saying we want both robust early voting 2 weeks and we want no excuse vote by mail, because we think that's good electoral policy. And we don't like voter ID, and we want automatic voter registration. We even want same-day registration. These are all the things that we want. But and even if that is better policy in my personal view, it's not undemocratic, small d, to think, well, early voting is better. We don't really like no excuse absentee voting. We'd prefer excuse-based absentee voting, but robust early voting. For the People Act, it's kind of like a belt and suspenders at the national federal level. It's saying every single state in the country has to do it our way. And that is the philosophical premise of the bill, that has allowed Senator McConnell to have a unified opposition to it, because Republicans tend to believe in more autonomy for the states. Let states make policy choices. So the attitude here should have been, after January 6th, what is absolutely essential at a national level that's non-negotiable? We have to do this, otherwise we don't have a democracy at all, and insist upon that, versus, okay, in a state like Massachusetts or maybe New Jersey or whatever, we'll have the kind of policies that the Democratic Party prefers, because those states are in control of Democrats, and you can have same-day voter registration there. But a state like Ohio isn't going to want same-day voter registration, but they're still going to have a democracy. It's just not going to be a one-size-fits-all. But the For the People Act is designed to be one-size-fits-all in a way that I think, again, it's both a strategic and a tactical mistake. Now back to the timing point. The redistricting issue, which is really crucial, because gerrymandering is a real evil. What gerrymandering is an attempt by one political party, and both parties, frankly, have engaged in this from time to time when they're in power. It's to say, how can we manipulate the drawing of district lines to try to deprive the voters of their authentic choice, and instead, rig the system, use that term, so the politicians can stay in power, that one party can cling to power, even if the voters say it's time for new government. So it is fundamentally undemocratic. If you care about letting the people rule, letting voters decide, gerrymandering is anathema number one. And the Republicans want to do it. In fact, some of them have been brazen in saying they think they're going to win back control of the House solely because in the states, they can manipulate the process to their advantage to screw the voters, as it were. So if you're focusing on existential threats to democracy, you should be really focusing on this and figuring out how to, so that no political party can manipulate the process to the expense of democracy and the voters in this distortion, manipulative way. And by the way, if the Republicans get to do this and control the House that way, they're well positioned to do next January 6, 2025, what they were incapable of doing because they didn't have the votes this January 6th. This January 6th was horrific in terms of ugliness, but it was not successful in preventing the inauguration of the president that the voters voted for, despite the big lie and the real threat. So gerrymandering is a threat not just to the composition of the House and letting the people get the representatives in Congress that they want, but it's a threat down the road to the subversion of the presidential election next time. So, but again, in terms of timing, the first issue the clock is ticking on is these new maps have to be drawn for the midterms very, very soon. The census data is coming out next month in August. The states are going to start drawing these maps. And right now, under the current law, any state where a political party is in power, whether it's the Democrats in one state or the Republicans in another, they can be as aggressive with respect to gerrymandering as they can get away with, because the Supreme Court says that they can't stop this unless Congress writes a law to stop it. So this is really incumbent upon Congress to stop gerrymandering, but it's hidden on page whatever 372, I don't know what page it is, but it's buried in an 800-page bill, and it's going to die if this bill gets stalled. And so if it were up to me, I would take the gerrymandering piece out of the bill. I'd put that to a vote now because this is so important, and I would fight the filibuster fight on this single issue, because there is no policy defense to gerrymandering. It is pure partisan greed. So if you have a well-crafted standalone bill on gerrymandering, what's the Republican defense going to be? Oh, we think we should be allowed to manipulate the process against the voters' will. I just think that's not an easy fight to have. It's easy for Mitch McConnell right now to say there's too much in the bill. It takes away control from the states. If the fight is solely on gerrymandering, I think that's a different matter. Plus, if this filibuster could be converted to this idea of a talking filibuster, like President Biden mentioned, where the Republicans have to come up with 41 votes to stop it on a day-by-day basis. I think that's going to be a very, very hard thing to do. Say day after day, we're stopping, the right to reform the districting process so that we can have fair maps. So, I understand these other issues are important. Voting rights is important. We've got to have the John Lewis bill to improve the Voting Rights Act, but that can happen later. What has to happen right now is stopping gerrymandering. And I don't believe Congress is going about it in the right way. So let me stop there and let Dan have a chance to respond, and then we can go back and forth for a little bit and take questions and have a discussion.
Well, no, I appreciate those comments. And look, I think, we both agree on a lot of the substance. I will just push back a little bit on this notion. You said sort of there are two strains through here. One is, I think you eloquently laid out the stakes, particularly around gerrymandering. And then you talked a little bit about bipartisanship. And I do think that has been the fundamental tension throughout this process, which is that you are talking particularly on gerrymandering about an issue that is to some extent existential. And I truly don't think a redistricting reform bill would get 60 votes in the Senate right now. I think that they have to find a way to do this, and that there would not have been a way to go about it where you could have gotten major bipartisan support. Right now, the parties are somewhat polarized on this issue. There are folks who were formerly in office who've spoken out on gerrymandering, but in Congress right now, I think it is very, very hard. I think that if you look at the actual provisions of the For the People Act, the vast majority are provisions, something like automatic voter registration is something that Republicans have supported, in droves in the states. So automatic voter registration, which I'll stop and explain what that is. That's a system that instead of you have to go and fill out a form and you can the form in, and then it's handed over to someone else who then enters your data on the form and then puts it in. That's a sort of legacy voter registration. Automatic voter registration is basically when you go to the DMV, if you're a citizen, you're going to be, and you provide your information, you're going to be automatically registered unless you affirmatively opt out. So it is a modern voter registration system that actually costs less, streamlines the process, and it also involves automatic data transfers between the agencies that collect the information and election officials. It's a policy the Brennan Center pioneered. It's been adopted in 19 states in the District of Columbia, and it is very popular in red and purple states. It's been adopted in Georgia. It's been adopted in West Virginia. So it was passed unanimously in Illinois. So all the policies in this bill are policies Republicans have supported for decades, or the vast majority are policies Republicans have supported for decades. So I think it's a little bit unfair to say that the bill was kind of crafted, as the Democratic wish list with no account of, what Republicans might want or what Republicans. I'm sure there are many things Democrats would do if they had the opportunity and they really didn't have to take Republican equities into account. We can quibble all day about what the political strategy behind this bill was. I mean, the reality right now is that there are very intense negotiations going on. Senator Manchin does, there is likely to be the legislative process is going to take place where the thing that originally was the For the People Act is going to be negotiated into something that has 50 votes in the Senate and then possibly can get some Republican support. And that is going to be the vehicle for what passes. And I think that's very important. I just think it's problematic to try to second guess what they could or could not have done. And again, Ned laid out the stakes very, very, very eloquently. And I'll add, by the way, of course, that the wave of voter suppression we're seeing in the states is a pretty partisan wave. In the worst laws in Georgia and in Texas, in Iowa, these are being passed on party line votes. So it's also a little difficult to say to Democrats in Congress, you need to be bipartisan responding to some blatantly partisan efforts to suppress the vote in the states. Nevertheless, I mean, we are where we are right now, and I think we are on the cusp of still being able to pass a very, very strong package. And that I think, Ned is absolutely right. Gerrymandering has to be front and center because that is where the clock is really ticking, and that is what underscores the urgency of doing this. And there's also another reason why, trying to assemble, however, 60 votes in the Senate while it would be preferable, is not necessarily an option, because we need to act now. And it is very true that this is, historically been a bipartisan phenomenon. It is also true right now that, some Republican state legislators seem very determined to seize this advantage. And if you don't act now, it's going to be very deleterious to our democracy, to both parties in the long term, because I don't think it's actually the long-term advantage of the Republican Party to behave this way. Nevertheless, I think it's human nature, and that's where we're headed. And the last thing I'll just say is, the other way in which this is important, and there is no one provision, same-day voter registration, whatever, that on which the fate of the republic rests. Okay, but when we're talking about efforts to manipulate the vote count, when we're talking about efforts to manipulate voting rules, the best defense of that is to have a uniform set of rules that apply to everyone. And Mitch McConnell or other public figures may respectfully disagree, but the reality is, if we really want to stop the sort of shenanigans that we're seeing in Arizona and in other places right now, having a clear, uniform set of federal rules is the answer. It is right and proper to be negotiating over them, and Senator Manchin is, I think, playing a perfectly valuable role in kind of negotiating for what he thinks should be his policy priorities. But there has to be a set of realism, which is, as Senator Schumer said, sort of failure is not an option here. And that really is what they need to focus on now, whatever one might think of the political strategy over the past, 2 years.
Just really quick, and then let's go to the audience Q&A. Yes, I think there are some provisions that have historically had bipartisan support and should. I think there were in the initial bill some clear poison pills from a Republican perspective. We can, I could rattle them off. Details aren't so important, but there were some things that were clear non-starters. And again, I think a lot of time was wasted trying to stick with those. But anyway, the second thing is, even if Republicans are willing to say they're for a certain policy, as a matter of policy, they might prefer that policy to be implemented at the state level than the federal level. And while I agree that there has to be some thresholds and baselines below which no state can go, there's got to be a minimum federal floor on the basic right to vote, and that ballots are cast and counted fairly. I think states should be allowed to do better. I don't think we want a national straitjacket of uniformity. If some states have good ideas about how to prove the process, they should allow to be better. So I think there's a reasonable argument to be had on what that federal floor is and should look like. And finally, I think it is a genuine unknown, what either would have happened or still would happen if a standalone anti-gerrymandering bill, was put in front of the Senate and there was an effort to try to get 10 Republicans. For one thing, senators don't benefit from gerrymandering, right? The gerrymandering is a problem in the House because it's a feature of districting. So no Republican senator has their own personal political fortunes affected by this. There are 5 Republican senators who are retiring and might do something for the sake of patriotism. And there are 5 other Republicans who are more reasonable. So, I think it would have been a tough sell to get all 10, but I also think you first make that effort on that single issue. You spotlight this issue, which is so existential for the reasons that Dan and I agree. And if you can't find 10 reasonable Republicans who are willing to say that gerrymandering is bad and should be stopped, which is kind of outrageous if that were true, that's where you go and say, we've got to either modify the filibuster or reform it to the point where we have to stop gerrymandering one way or the other. And if we can't get 10 Republican senators to do it, we'll have to find some other way.
I think the one thing where we might disagree a little bit is that I think gerrymandering is one of the most major threats to our political system. And I want to say, by the way, because those who might be familiar with American history might be thinking to themselves, well, wasn't there gerrymandering in like 1789, right? Why are you suddenly so upset? And one of the things that's the problem is that gerrymandering, this is not your grandfather's gerrymandering or even your father's gerrymandering, right? This is a much more technologically sophisticated, methods that also frankly benefits from more residential sorting. So it is much, much more feasible to draw these very, very permanent gerrymanders that really can lock a party into power even when it loses substantial political support. So that's why I think Ned and I agree that this is so important. I don't necessarily think that gerrymandering is the single only major existential issue for our democracy right now. I actually think voter suppression is too, and I think that our out of control campaign finance system is. So I can't agree that they should have just gone with this one issue. Suffice to say, though, what we are having right now as part of the legislative process is a whittling down of what actually has the votes to pass. It's not something that, I don't work on the Capitol Hill, I'm a policy expert, but that is the process they're having right now, whether or not we think it should have been earlier or frustrated or not. And so that's sort of what's important right now. And Senator Manchin, again, put out a list of things he supported and that he thought he could get bipartisan support that was broader than gerrymandering and that actually encompassed a number of issues. And in some sense, my guess is that that is going to be kind of the baseline, and then it's going to be somewhere between that and what is in the For the People Act now. Whether it should have been as long as it was, whether it should have been shorter, at the end of the day, we are where we are right now. And what I want to focus on, and maybe we can turn to that, is that, the very real prospect that we will have a significant democracy reform that could maybe go the distance.
Yeah, real quick, I think the combination of gerrymandering and the big lie interact together in a way that is a special threat to what we have now. So the people have heard the phrase election subversion. That's the refusal to count votes properly. To me, the mindset of gerrymandering, the mindset of election subversion comes from the same willingness, unfortunately, of politicians to, again, manipulate the rules for their own advantage at the expense of the voters. I also think that the right to cast a ballot is essential. Every American needs to have an adequate opportunity to cast a vote. But I frankly think much, much too much of the public debate over the last 6 months has focused on casting issues in contrast to counting issues and in gerrymandering. Yes, there are threats to the capacity to cast a vote, but they are not nearly as severe as these other threats. And our discourse has been skewed by so much focus on that. And again, the time, if the Manchin bill I'm in favor of the Manchin compromise. And if that, including the gerrymandering piece, all gets adopted in the next 2 weeks, hallelujah. But I saw a report out of USA Today that was quoting Senator Klobuchar, which was basically sort of saying we're giving up until the fall. Well, giving up until the fall means losing the fight over gerrymandering. And so, if the negotiations over the Manchin bill and the parallel John Lewis bill means that nothing's going to happen until later in the fall, that's again giving up on at least one of the huge priorities. So.
Yeah, we should get to Q&A, but I have not heard anyone, and including not Senator Klobuchar, say that, we're resigned to doing it in the fall. I think they understand the urgency. And there, I think Ned and I agree fully that waiting until the fall is unacceptable and that you really do need to make this a priority. I think that the path that it's taken from now is not unreasonable as the way to approach it, but in any event, you cannot underscore enough how urgent this is to move now. And my impression is that the key deciders in Congress and hopefully the White House understand that. If not, they should. So with that, I don't know, Rhoda, if we want to take questions.
Yes, it's time for the Q&A session. So what I'm going to do is take each question in the order with which it came in. Some of the questions I've looked them over and I think you've answered them, but I'll still offer them up anyway. So the first question is, does any section of the federal Constitution prevent the Congress from enacting voter rights that apply to all states? Will it require a change of the filibuster rule in the Senate to pass this act?
Well, I can
So
take this.
I'll just jump in on one quick. So there's one piece of the For the People Act which would ban felon disenfranchisement. I'm a huge opponent of felon disenfranchisement. I think I think every American citizen has the right to vote. Unfortunately, the Constitution in 14th Amendment specifically permits states to engage in felon disenfranchisement. So I do think the portion of the For the People Act that would stop states from that practice, as much as I hated it as a matter of policy, it goes beyond what's constitutionally permissible on that point.
So I disagree, although I respect that point of view. I think that, to take the larger question, so Congress has actually fairly broad authority to set the rules for federal elections. The states have sort of the primary responsibility, but the Constitution, the text of the Constitution, gives Congress the right to supplant their rules with its own, and Congress has done that a number of times. The National Voter Registration Act, the Help America Vote Act. There are pieces that have been attacked more, including the reenfranchisement piece. I will say that it doesn't require all people who've been convicted of felonies to vote. It simply says that when they're released from incarceration, their rights have to be automatically restored. So it is that sort of voting eligibility rule. And I think that, notwithstanding that, the states can disenfranchise folks who've been convicted, setting that kind of bright line rule is within both Congress's, power to remediate, because there are huge racial disparities with these laws. It's within its power to remediate voting discrimination. And then I think it's also within its broad power to sort of set the rules for federal elections. Respect that, there are differences of opinion on that. I will say, though, that, beyond that piece, though, the vast majority of the act, I think even the court's most skeptical members would concede is constitutional, because in the text of the act, it says that these are things Congress can address. Chief Justice John Roberts, when he was writing a pretty awful decision saying even the most extreme gerrymandering, just the Supreme Court wasn't going to do anything, said, take this up with Congress. Congress has the power to do something about this. And the same, Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, in opposing states' ability state courts' ability to strike down vote suppression laws, has also said, but Congress could do something. So I do think that there is, if not every single provision of this bill, the vast majority of the provisions, certainly everything that's under Manchin has embraced, is eminently constitutional. In terms of the filibuster, I think we've been talking about that. I think I do not ever give up on the idea that you could get 10 Republicans supporting this. I think that this bill is certainly consistent with the historic values of the Republican Party as much as the Democratic Party. I think that, most people who look at the political realities now say that there probably has to be some change to the filibuster to get over this hump. But again, I would really encourage people not to look at it as a binary, that either you have to abolish the filibuster or you don't. Like, I think that there are many ways, and there historically have been many, alterations to the filibuster that have been made. So I think, if that happens, it's could very well be a path like that, not just straight abolition.
Okay, a couple of bill questions that I'll combine that speak to the length of the bill, and people are wondering if the bill were shorter and paired to its essentials, would it likely pass the Senate?
Ned, I'll let you start with that.
No, I definitely think the Manchin compromise has a greater chance of success but this is going to be tough no matter what, I think. It's going to be very tough to get 60 votes for anything. And that's why I think I would just take them in chunks, because I do, sometimes you think legislative, and I'm not an expert in legislative strategy either. I'm an election law scholar, but my sense is that sometimes the Christmas tree approach is better. Like, you pile things on like a pork barrel legislation, and you hope you add votes that way. I think this bill is the opposite. I think the larger this bill is, the harder it's going to get to cross either 51 votes by breaking the filibuster, or in some way, shape, or form, or getting to 60 votes. So I would, and again, for timing reasons, I would just start with the gerrymandering piece and then take up different pieces one at a time. But could the Manchin compromise as a package make it through? Again, I think harder for that to get 60 votes than just the gerrymandering piece, because the gerrymandering piece is part of it. Would it be easier to break the filibuster in one way, shape, or form on the whole Manchin bill than a piece at a time? I don't think so. So again, I would, there are these components. There's no requirement in the Constitution that you have a large bill. Each one of these things could be legislated separately. And so, and I would test it out. That's part of the reason why I would at least do this for gerrymandering is test the strategy. Pull that out as a signal issue, have a fight over that, including the fight on filibuster reform, and see what happens. And that will give you some lessons learned to come back to the issues like voter registration and absentee voting. You'd learn something, I think, from the debate on gerrymandering itself.
Yeah, I guess it's just hard because I'm also not a legislative strategist. There are many very experienced legislative strategists working on this. It doesn't mean, I'm not saying, oh, trust them, they know what they're doing, although I tend to think they do, but it's perfectly legitimate to have this conversation. I think that I just am very skeptical that you would get any farther breaking it up into chunks than you would, doing some sort of package. Where we are, though, right now is that you have what Ned called the Manchin compromise. I think then, that is, there is also the original For the People Act, and I think there are elements of that bill that ultimately will also, it's not just the things Senator Manchin outlined, but essentially that is the path that at least it seems to be headed right now. I think that path has a pretty good chance, certainly a decent chance of succeeding. I think that one thing that both of us are saying right now, whatever you think about how we got here, is that time is of the essence. And they really do. And that is also true, with the John Lewis Act, which is another we haven't talked about, but it was a critical bill that while nothing is as urgent as gerrymandering, all of this stuff, right, needs to be put on the front burner. That's happening. We'll see. But what is, the questioner's thing was should be stripped down to its most essential provisions. That is essentially what is happening right now. And that, seems to be what is positioning it for success. I do think that this is part of the legislative process. I think there's been no major piece of legislation recently that has not started in a much different place than it ended up. The Affordable Care Act, the Trump tax cuts. And I also would just say, this is a sort of a minor point, but everyone says, oh, it's a very long bill. It's not an especially long bill for a major bill in Congress. It's much shorter than, the China trade package that just passed, which is much, runs into the thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. Not that I'm counting, but, this is, I guess, it's unsatisfying, but it is kind of the legislative process. And as the process moves along, it's now being distilled into what has political support. And none of us are going to end up, perfectly content with the outcome. And that's to be expected. There are a lot of things I would have liked to see that weren't in the original bill. And there's going to probably be more things that I would like to see that won't be in whatever finally passes. But that's how government works.
Yeah, let me just say one more thing. Bills do not have to be, I agree, there are lots of long bills, but they don't have to be long. And in fact, one of the things that I wish Congress had taken up is a bill that fits on a single PowerPoint slide, which would require members of Congress to win a majority of votes in the November general election if they won. Most Americans think you have to win a majority of votes to win a seat in Congress. It's not true. You only need what's called a plurality. And for mathematical reasons that we don't need to get into tonight, the combination of party primaries combined with this plurality winner rule that exists as state law is causing real problems. To me, and to my mind, it is as much a structural problem as gerrymandering is. And when you hear about how President Trump wants to primary as a way of revenging, he's using primary as a verb, and he wants to attack people who care about honest elections, like Liz Cheney or like members of Congress who voted for impeachment. He's abusing the system, but the system is not well designed. And if you had a majority winner requirement, which again could be a 3-line bill. In fact, there was a version of this in the 19th century that disappeared for reasons, again, we don't need to get into. Very short bill. It would have an incredibly positive transformative effect on American politics. It's not, it's not, in all 800 pages of For the People Act, it does not contain this majority winner provision, unfortunately.
You want to add it, Ned? I'm sure they'd add it if you want.
It would be awesome.
That's 3 pages. I mean, just make a pitch.
Yeah, add it, Stan, whatever. It'd be great. But politics is the art of the possible, and so we'll have, as Dan was saying, we'll just have to see what is capable of getting through in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. This one about Texas. The Texas voting reforms allows voting by mail, but simply asks for verification on the part of the voter, allowing the voter to indicate the driver's license number or asks for numbers of Social Security, or to request from, let's see, what have I got here? The state a voting number to include on the mail to vote. What is wrong with this to eliminate ballot harvesting or votes submitted by a deceased person? Oh boy.
Well, those are some different issues. I mean, I think that the baseline we should talk about is that fraud in this, which is this ostensible ill that is trying to be avoided here, is vanishingly rare. So you have to ask, when you're putting all these additional requirements on, what's the basis for needing that? Like, why is there all of a sudden this push to include all sorts of new restrictions when there's no evidence that there's any problem that they're combating? So the issue of voter ID, as we've always said, is that it disproportionately, what might seem like a kind of benign burden for someone who's relatively affluent. I mean, should someone at another event, I said, shouldn't voting be harder than booking a plane ticket online? Yes, that I suppose that's a reasonable point, except that most of these new restrictions are targeting folks who would never even have enough money to buy a plane ticket. Like, this is not, so what might seem like, a relatively easy thing to overcome for you or me might look very different for someone else. Nevertheless, we can have a debate about what reasonably should or should not be required. I do want to take issue with the term ballot harvesting, which gets thrown around a lot. I mean, again, ballot security is very important. For many communities, though, the ability to have someone return your mail ballot, for instance, Native American communities who live in rural areas, is very important. And so laws like Texas's that say that basically you can only have your ballot returned by yourself or a member of your household, that poses a real burden for people. And so mixing all of these issues together, the reality is that as Ned is arguing hasn't happened in Congress, like, it's not like there was a kind of reasonable back and forth on this law. Again, we are seeing that most of these worst laws are being passed on pretty strict party line grounds. So, ballot integrity is important, but I do think we just need to look at who's actually bearing the brunt of these new requirements? And why are they suddenly being proposed now?
Yeah, just real quick on this issue. I think that a numerical identification for vote by mail is actually more voter friendly than signature matching. Signature matching is very arbitrary, leads to a lot of rejected ballots that are problematic. So if you had a well-designed numerical ID, such as I think the questioner was suggesting, so that it was either your driver's license or social, last 4 digits of social, or a number that you could get free of charge from the government when you register to vote, that's actually probably a better system from the voter's perspective. So I agree with Dan. Not every voter ID rule is equally stringent, and I think it is important to acknowledge that some voter ID systems can actually work to the benefit of the voter as long as they don't operate as a poll tax or as an unreasonable restriction. But unfortunately, I think sometimes the polemics of this, mean that people say any form of voter ID is problematic, and I think that paints with too broad a brush.
Yeah, and I do really want to emphasize, we would not be having this discussion if this was just about having to put your social security number in the inner seal of your mail ballot. I do think it's a bit disingenuous to say that was just what the Texas law was about. And even the question kind of gives the lie to that, because then, you flip from that to ballot harvesting, which is a reference to a very different issue.
Yeah, although you and I think Dan disagree. I mean, I think there's a reasonable middle ground position. In fact, the American Law Institute project that I was part of spent months and months and months debating this issue to come up with a compromise that basically said, if it isn't a member of your household who returns a ballot, there's a limited number of ballots they can return in any given day. And, that allows, that's make sure that voters can participate appropriately. But where we see problems, we see it with ballot collection, right? Whether it's North Carolina or Miami, Florida, or smaller local races. Again, I don't want to overstate the degree of the problem, but it is not accurate in my judgment to say that there is zero risk associated with third-party ballot collection.
That's entirely fair. So I think there is like a lot of actually common ground. Like the legislative process is working, and I guess I just want to emphasize again, it may be unsatisfying, Ned, you may feel that it didn't go the way it is, but the legislative process is working its way towards some of these reasonable compromises. Like the Brennan Center, like we don't have, a view that you're necessarily wrong, right? It's that these are difficult issues, and I do think the discussion of them tends to understate the risk that you're going to be placing burdens on the most vulnerable voters. Nevertheless, ballot security, I think everyone agrees, is an important issue, and that there has to be a way for determining verifying voters' identities. And it's a reasonable debate that like policy experts are having right now. But I return to the idea that we would not be here if this was just about whether you should have to put your social security number on your mail ballot.
Okay, next question. What new acts by the states would make it harder for minority voters to vote?
Well, I think that there are a number that are especially problematic, but obviously a long time target has been rollbacks to early voting. You saw particularly, and thankfully in the last round in Georgia, they were taken out, but an effort for a while to eliminate Sunday voting, which is obviously when many African-American churches launched Souls to the Polls drives. So that is a huge one. I think rollbacks or limits on mail voting can disproportionately impact certain communities of color, particularly Native American communities. Of course, voter ID, while it's obviously a contentious issue, but if done in the most strict and ill thought out or punitive form can also disproportionately impact voters of color. In North Dakota, for example, they required ID that had an address on it, even though they knew that, you know, many Native Americans didn't living on reservations did not have street addresses. And then gerrymandering. I mean, getting back to our favorite topic here, gerrymandering frequently targets communities of color. And one of the most pernicious sort of things is that the Supreme Court has at times kind of suggested, because actually racial gerrymandering is, you know, can be, is unconstitutional in many contexts. Many times communities of color will be targeted as a proxy for their supposed political beliefs. So that, you know, and the gerrymanders will say, well, I wasn't targeting them because they were Black, I was targeting them because, you know, they're Democrats. But the idea that, you know, that these two things can just be neatly separated, right, means that often gerrymandering is used as a tool to crack, you know, the power of communities of color. And when it's one of the reasons, again, not just because one side or the other will get a permanent advantage, but also because of this sort of way that communities, particularly in these fast growing Southeastern states, will essentially be disenfranchised if we don't do something about it.
If there's time for one more question, why don't we do that instead of me weighing in on that one?
Okay, well, we have a few more questions, so bear with me. One is, do you feel the Democrats' behavior is just a backlash to Republican behavior, a question of control of power?
Well, you know, I do, no, I mean, I think there's, you know, I think a lot of members of Congress, you know, have good faith beliefs and principles. So I don't want to impute bad motive to every member of Congress. That would be, you know, really inappropriate. On the other hand, I do think sometimes the Democratic Party acts on behalf of its own partisan interests. It is a political party. It wants to hold power. And so sometimes the Democratic Party isn't always acting consistent with my judgment of small d democratic values. When the Democrats engage in gerrymandering, as they sometimes do, they're contrary to good democracy. On the issue of election subversion, the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives went quite far down the road this year about thinking about taking away a seat in Iowa that was won by a Republican. Fortunately, in my judgment, they decided not to really go that far, because it would have been a very ugly power grab. And there were some moderate members of the House, as I understand it, who said, no, we don't want to lose the moral high ground because we're so upset about what Trump did on January 6th and so forth. But I think the instinct of politicians to hold power, in my judgment, meant that they went farther down that road in that one House seat than was sound from a good government, fair voting, you know, interest of the voters perspective. So the Democrats are not always pure as a political party.
Yeah, I definitely would agree that neither party is always pure. Just like I would think Ned made perfectly valid points that the Republican Party's, at least some of its opposition to these, you know, to the For the People Act or some of its provisions, also is sincere and is not just motivated by rank partisanship. What I will say is that, again, I do take issue with the idea that the key provisions of the For the People Act are partisan in that sense. Early voting, vote by mail, these do not necessarily benefit Democrats. In fact, until this last election, you know, vote by mail in many places was probably, you know, a net benefit for Republicans. And Republicans also you know, vote early in very large numbers, including in critical swing states like Florida. So, you know, I do not see the For the People Act as kind of a partisan reaction to Republican partisanship in that say. I think that is what Democrats in Congress generally believe is the best for an open and inclusive democracy. And I respect that, you know, there are differences from some Republicans. Again, like, I think that, you know, the negotiations are happening now. I will also note that the first time the For the People Act passed, it passed when Republicans controlled the Senate. So it is a situation where, you know, the Republicans did have the opportunity then to try to negotiate and pass a bipartisan package, and for whatever reason weren't interested then. So I think, you know, both parties are to some extent fighting for what they believe in, but the reason the Brennan Center certainly supports so strongly this bill is because we think it's the right thing for American voters, not because we think it will benefit one party or the other.
Right. You mentioned gerrymandering as being so key, and this questioner wants to know, how does the bill address gerrymandering?
So there's a little tricky, but it requires states that don't already have independent redistricting commissions to establish them, and then has a few ancillary provisions about how those independent commissions would operate in order to avoid gerrymandering. I mean, Dan could go into more details, but I think the key element is this obligation to do it by independent commissions.
Although I think for immediate purposes, you know, I would say that the most immediate thing for this cycle, it's a little less clear, is just going to be that the bill literally bans partisanship as a consideration in drawing district lines. So you know, it sets forth the criteria that need to be used to draw congressional maps, and the criteria really would be protecting communities who are protected under the Voting Rights Act, so communities of color, and then, you know, protecting communities of interest, which is sort of just the more broader sense of the types of communities who have common political or societal interests that, you know, appropriately should be drawn into the same district, say people in the same town or you know, in the same economic community. And then it very strictly just bans partisanship as a consideration. And you could get a map thrown out if it was shown that partisanship was a motivating factor. And so for the upcoming cycle, I think it's likely probably that that's going to be the most consequential aspect of the bill.
Yeah, and that's an important development or important clarification, because I think a bill written in that way makes sense, particularly for this election. I think the commission approach adds a layer of complexity that could be a
There's
problem.
just a question of whether you could stand up, states could stand up redistricting commissions in the short amount of time
Right.
where they're supposed to draw lines.
Yeah, there's also a constant, I think banning gerrymandering directly doesn't raise any constitutional problem. Requiring states to have commissions at least raises an issue that could be subject to litigation.
Yeah. All right, we'll take a couple more questions and call it a night. This one is, with the enormous advances in tech, how can we have an electoral system so antiquated, especially the counting?
That's a good question. I tend to focus more on voter registration, which I think really is ridiculously antiquated in some places, given our system. I don't know, Ned, if you want to talk specifically about counting. I mean, my overarching point is that speed is not, you know, that was one of the most pervasive and wrong things in this election. Is accuracy is the most important consideration in the counting of votes, not rapidity. It's nice to know the election results on election night, but it has often been the case that we have not. Sometimes it takes much longer. And at the end of the day, you want an accurate result, and it's not something that it's a travesty if you have to wait longer. It's ideal if you know the results as quickly as possible, but again, the gold standard is that they be correct.
Yeah, and I think on the counting side, sometimes I hear the question, well, we have online banking, you know, with ease of computer technology, why can't we just have online voting? And the issue there is that it's perfectly okay to kind of have a printed receipt of your online transaction to make sure that you can hold a bank accountable in case of an error. We don't allow voters to take home a printed receipt of their ballot, because that would be inconsistent with the idea of the secret ballot, which is, you know, both for the voters' benefit and also avoid coercion or, you know, purchasing ballots as used to exist in the 19th century. So there's the secrecy of the ballot imposes some inabilities to use the full advance of computer technology, and we haven't had an ability to solve that, and we probably won't for a couple of decades, is my guess.
And again, that I go back to, where we should be more technologically advanced is in getting people registered and getting them the opportunity to vote. But that for all the reasons Ned said, like when it comes to actually counting the votes, the standard of care and the other constraints are just not comparable to any other or to most other transactions you would engage in society.
Okay, the last two questions. This one, as a strategy, are third-party election audits by groups like Cyber Ninjas here to stay, if no other reason than to undermine faith in our elections? What do you think?
Well, I sure hope not. And in a way, it can't be the case, because we're not going to be able to have a system that functions if those kind of third-party audits become the standard operating procedure. It's antithetical to the values of transparency and, again, bipartisanship. I mean, and there was a headline yesterday in both Pennsylvania now and in Arizona before, localities have had their equipment decertified because they handed them over to the third parties in a way that violate all the rules and practices of voter integrity and election integrity. So, if this becomes the new normal, we're not going to be able to run elections because we won't have certified machines to run them with. So
these aren't audits. I mean, they're charades. They're sham audits. And so, as Ned says, this can't be, it would be catastrophic if this becomes the new normal, and responsible folks on both sides of the aisle really need to make sure it doesn't.
Okay, we got the last question, which I think is probably the right note to end this conversation on, and that is, what path is there for HR.1, for getting HR.1 passed if Manchin and Sinema won't repeal the filibuster, and Biden just said he doesn't want to have that fight?
And again, I come back to, if you look closely at the public statements of all of these people, it is not a binary between repeal or don't repeal the filibuster. All of them at various times have suggested openness to modifications to the filibuster. President Biden did very recently. All of them have also clearly articulated the stakes. The president, just in a speech last week, said that this is, a national imperative. Senator Manchin has said inaction is not an option. So there are a lot of different paths that this can take, beyond just abolishing the filibuster. And, there are many of us who might think, that abolishing the filibuster is maybe the right thing to do for a variety of reasons. That's the Brennan Center's position, certainly, that we've taken, but that is not the thing that needs to happen for this bill to pass. And so, a lot can change in politics. I think a lot is actually moving right now. And the thing folks can do, if you care about this, is to let your elected leaders know that, again, failure is not an option and that this is your top priority. These issues tend to suffer a little bit from a sort of cliche in Washington that voters always tell pollsters that they care about them or that they're important, but then it's actually not a priority relative to so-called kitchen table issues. But the reality is that the health of our democracy impacts the health of our economy. It impacts, virtually every aspect of our society. And so what folks need to do is let your elected representatives know that they need to get this done. But I don't think that thinking about it in terms of these binary absolutes is the right way to go, because I think there are many different paths for this to make it over the finish line.
And just real quick, I would say the most realistic path that I see at the moment is conversion to the so-called talking filibuster that would put the burden, as Dan said, on the opposition to come up with the 41 votes to block. I think that is still plausible in the public statements that the president and Senators Manchin and Sinema have said. So I think that should be the focus in getting that procedural rule change as soon as possible, because the clock is ticking. And then you're going to have to actually go through the process, right? Because there will be the capacity of objectors to try to at least sustain the objection, and you got to wear them down. And so that's where I do think that the content of the bill and the public conversation over what's in it and how to talk about it will make a difference in the capacity of there to be 41 objectors sustaining objections for, for as long as they feel that they're able to do that. So,
and I do think that the other thing that is on the table is possibly changing the vote threshold, or having some sort of staggered thing where the threshold starts at 60 but then gets lower with each vote. I think those options are potentially on the table as well.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting option. I'm less, based on what I've seen said in public, I'm less sanguine that that's a viable thing, but maybe senators change their mind. But I thought Manchin specifically ruled that out.
So I will make clear that I have no inside information. I just will say that and maybe this is a note to leave it on, well, is that every single major piece of legislation that has been passed in Washington in the past 50 years has been declared dead at least a dozen times before it was passed for some reason. The Affordable Care Act is a great example. So people's public statements, certainly, that could be the case, that's non-negotiable, but what we often see is that there's more given the joints than that indicates. Neither Ned or I necessarily knows who's right now, but I think that it certainly is proceeding right now with at least more than one plausible path to getting done.
Let's leave it there for the sake of moving forward. How about that?
Yeah. Well, let's hope we do move forward. But if the polls are correct, most Americans want to see fair voting, and voter rights is popular. So listen, this was a great conversation, and I think our audience was very enlightened, and hopefully they have things to think about. So I want to thank you so much, Daniel Weiner and Ned Foley. It was a great conversation, and we'll probably continue this conversation in the future. Maybe you'll come back at another time and we can get more current. So thank you so much. And to my audience, thank you so much for attending. And we hope you'll complete the survey that we're going to send you tomorrow. And our video will be posted to our website within a few days. So thank you all very much. And thank you especially for giving us a great program tonight.
Thank
so
you.
With that,
it was a pleasure.
We'll call it an evening. And
good night, everyone.
Thank you again. Good night.
Good night.